In November 1986, investigators made a discovery so horrific that it would forever change how forensic science approaches murder cases. Along the frozen banks of Lake Zor in Connecticut, they found fragments of human bone, strands of hair, and a single tooth crown scattered like confetti after a celebration nobody wanted to attend. What they discovered next would make this case legendary in true crime history. The victim had been fed through a wood chipper. But here's what haunts me about this case, and what should terrify you too. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored every warning sign screaming at you to run? Have you ever been so blinded by love that you convinced yourself their controlling behavior was just protection? Do you know someone right now who makes excuses for their partner's jealousy, their isolation tactics, their need to know where they are every second of every day? Because if you answered yes to any of those questions, you need to hear Elena Markovich's story. This isn't just another murder case. This is about what happens when love becomes a prison, when marriage becomes a death sentence, and when the person sleeping next to you becomes your executioner. Elena Markovich was a beautiful, independent flight attendant who traveled the world, spoke multiple languages, and had everything going for her. She was married to Karim Almazy, a successful airline pilot who seemed like the perfect husband to their neighbors in suburban Connecticut. But Elena had started saying something chilling to her friends, something that would prove to be prophetic in the most devastating way possible. She whispered to them, "If anything happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." Those words would echo through courtrooms, haunt investigators, and ultimately help solve one of the most brutal murders in Connecticut history. What drove a respected airline pilot to commit such an unspeakable act of violence against his own wife? How did he think he could get away with literally erasing another human being from existence? Most importantly, what warning signs did everyone miss that could have saved Elena's life? Tonight, I'm taking you inside the Almazy marriage, behind the perfect facade of their suburban home, where neighbors saw the ideal international couple raising 3 beautiful children. You'll discover how Karim's secret affairs and controlling behavior escalated into something so monstrous that it defied comprehension. This case will show you exactly why domestic abuse is the most dangerous kind of violence, because it hides in plain sight, wearing the mask of love while plotting destruction. Stay with me as we expose the truth about what really happened on that snowy November night in 1986, and why Elena Markovich's final words to her friends might just save your life, or someone you love. To everyone in Brookville, Connecticut, Karim and Elena Almazy were living proof that fairy tales could come true in real life. Their neighbors would watch from kitchen windows as Karim loaded his pilot's uniform into his Mercedes before heading to the airport, always impeccably dressed, always confident. Elena would wave goodbye from their front porch, her Eastern European accent charming everyone who stopped to chat, her auburn hair catching the morning sun like polished copper. The Almazy house sat on Newfield Lane, a quiet street where children rode bicycles and families hosted barbecues in perfectly manicured backyards. Karim had chosen this location deliberately, far enough from the city to feel private, close enough to major airports for his demanding schedule. The house itself was impressive. Colonial style with white columns, expensive cars in the driveway, and windows that always seemed to glow warmly in the evenings. Elena Markovich had been born in 1947 just outside Zagreb, Yugoslavia, in a modest town where everyone knew each other's business. From childhood, she dreamed of escaping the narrow expectations of small community life. While other girls focused on settling down early, Elena immersed herself in languages, studying English, German, and Italian, convinced that the wider world was waiting for her. Her big opportunity came in her early 20s when Panworld Airways selected her for their prestigious international crew. It wasn't just a career move, it was her ticket out. Panworld was the crown jewel of aviation luxury during the 1970s, known for hiring only the most sophisticated and worldly flight attendants who could handle international routes gracefully. Elena flourished there. She learned to cater to demanding passengers with poise, deliver safety protocols flawlessly, and juggle cultures and accents with ease. Most importantly, she achieved freedom passport stamps from exotic cities, elegant hotels across the globe, and her own steady income untethered from anyone else's control. During a layover in New York in 1975, fate intervened. She met Karim Almazy, a young, charismatic pilot who worked the same airline roster. Where others found Elena intimidating, Karim seemed enchanted. His dark hair, polished accent, and stories about navigating storms over Europe impressed Elena deeply. Unlike other suitors, he spoke her professional language, understood her restless nature, and mirrored her sophistication. The romance moved quickly. Within months, Karim was arranging his flights to overlap with hers. They dined in London, shared evenings wandering through Paris, and exchanged quiet conversations in Frankfurt cafes. 6 months later, he staged a proposal in Rome's airport lounge, slipping a diamond ring inside a duty-free perfume box. Their wedding was held in Connecticut, balancing Elena's distant Yugoslav relatives and Karim's Lebanese family. The event was lavish, filled with guests, music, and luxury. Photographs captured the bride in a gown worth thousands, standing beside her groom as they cut into a towering cake with practiced grace. By 1976, they had settled in the Brookville house and soon welcomed 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl, each combining Elena's striking complexion with Karim's dark, watchful eyes. Neighbors adored Elena pushing her stroller through the quiet streets, always stylish, always warm in her greetings. To outsiders, the Almazys were an enviable international couple who had blended glamour with stability. Karim's thriving career as a pilot and Elena's respected position as a flight attendant created the financial security to afford foreign vacations, private education for their children, and gatherings that neighbors still remember. At these dinner parties, Karim would charm guests with aviation stories, while Elena served homemade Eastern European pastries and entertained in her usual effortless style. Yet, for those closest to Elena, subtle changes began to surface. She became more reserved when Karim was present, measured in her responses, careful with her expressions. The laughter that once defined her personality began appearing less often. Invitations to join colleagues for girls' nights out or casual gatherings were politely declined with explanations that always centered around family obligations or Karim's schedule. The perfect marriage began showing cracks that only the most attentive eyes could see. By 1982, the cracks in the Almazy marriage had grown too obvious to ignore. What initially appeared to be Karim's protective instinct hardened into relentless surveillance. He needed to know where Elena was at every moment outside her flights, who she spoke with, and what excuses she might try to offer for even the smallest delay. The questions started as casual but quickly turned into structured interrogations. After each trip, before she even set down her luggage, Karim would demand specifics. Which crew members she had dinner with, which hotel staff had interacted with her, why she hadn't called him exactly when he expected. The pressure was exhausting, and soon Elena found herself rehearsing explanations on the ride home, trying to anticipate what answers might keep him from exploding into suspicion. Colleagues on Panworld layovers began seeing the changes too. Once the adventurous traveler who never wasted an overseas stop, Elena now avoided sightseeing. She declined dinners and drinks with her fellow attendants, explaining that she was too tired or needed to make urgent phone calls back home. The life she once embraced with such freedom had become something she tiptoed through, constantly careful of casting even a shadow Karim might interpret the wrong way. Financial dependency soon followed. Despite Elena's solid income with the airline, Karim insisted all paychecks be routed through accounts he controlled. He rationed out portions for groceries, clothing, and household items only after questioning each purchase. If she wanted to buy shoes for their daughter or a simple coffee during a layover, she knew it would trigger an inquisition later. Slowly, the independence that had once defined Elena was stripped away, replaced by anxiety at the thought of every receipt. Elena discovered the most devastating betrayal in Karim's string of affairs. He didn't even try to mask his indiscretions. Flight attendants from other airlines phoned their home at odd hours, often asking for Karim directly. Neighbors saw him escorting women to restaurants and hotel parking lots. She found receipts from cities he wasn't scheduled to be in and items hinting at overnight stays that had nothing to do with work. When confronted, Karim responded with a troubling pattern. First denial, then blame, finally manipulation aimed at making Elena doubt herself. He accused her of paranoia, claimed the evidence was meaningless, and then pivoted the conversation by suggesting she was unreasonable, ungrateful, or too Western in her ideas about marriage. The sharpest weapon he used was turning their children into part of the control machinery. Karim distorted everyday family interactions, discrediting Elena's choices in front of the children, undermining her confidence as a mother. He encouraged them to tell him everything she did when he was away, feeding this information back in a way that made Elena feel constantly monitored. Even visits from Elena's Yugoslav relatives didn't break the pattern. Where once they had seen their daughter and sister bold and radiant, now they found her cautious, unwilling to speak freely, and prone to nervously deflecting when asked personal questions. The walls of isolation closed in further once Karim began cutting off her outside friendships altogether. He sabotaged social outings by creating false emergencies, intercepted calls from friends, and ensured that messages never reached her. Slowly, Elena's support network dissolved. By 1985, despite her resilience, Elena reached the breaking point. The life her neighbors admired had transformed into something suffocating. She quietly began to consider legal action, testing the waters by asking about divorce lawyers. But even in those tentative steps, she recognized a frightening truth: that disentangling herself from Karim Almazy wouldn't just be difficult, could be deadly. In the summer of 1985, Elena Markovich Almazy made a choice that revealed both her courage and her desperation. No longer willing to accept Karim's shifting lies and emotional manipulation, she sought certainty in the only way she knew how: proof that even Karim could not deny. She contacted a private investigator named Daniel Whitmore, a man known in Connecticut for discreet but thorough work on cases of suspected infidelity. Elena's voice, quiet and strained, carried both exhaustion and determination when she first met him in a small cafe 20 miles from her neighborhood. "I need the truth," she told him, her fingers nervously clasped around a coffee cup. "I need photographs, times, everything. When I confront him, I can't let him twist the story again." Daniel took on her case, and within little more than 2 weeks, he had more than enough evidence to end the debate. Karim's affairs weren't occasional lapses of loyalty. They were a pattern of brazen betrayal. Daniel documented him kissing a woman in a hotel parking lot, arm around her waist after dinner, on a night he had claimed to his wife he was scheduled for an overnight flight simulation. Other images showed him dining intimately, checking into hotels, and slipping out again in the early hours with women not his wife. When Daniel handed Elena the envelope filled with photographs, she sat in her car for 20 minutes unable to open it. When she finally gathered the courage, each image cut deeper than the last. The husband she had once trusted with her life appeared in snapshot after snapshot, laughing, affectionate, and free, expressions she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Barely able to catch her breath, Elena drove to the home of her closest friend, a fellow flight attendant named Claudia, who lived in nearby Danbury. Claudia found her sitting in the driveway, stiff with shock, the envelope clutched in her trembling hands. Inside, over cups of untouched tea, Elena spread the photos across the table and pointed bitterly at one. "Look at him. Look how much joy is in his face next to her. When was the last time you saw him look like that with me?" But then Elena said something that froze Claudia where she sat. As she gathered the photographs back into the envelope, Elena's voice steadied and her eyes locked on her friend's. "Claudia, you have to promise me this. If anything happens to me, do not assume it was an accident." Claudia stared at her, alarmed. "Elena, what are you saying? Are you afraid of him?" Elena nodded faintly. "More than you know. Karim believes he is always in control. If he ever feels me slipping away, he won't let me go. Men like him don't lose gracefully. They destroy what they can't keep." Claudia begged her not to speak that way, to believe there was still a safe way out, but Elena simply shook her head with a bitter smile. Those chilling words would echo long after November 1986, when the prediction she voiced at that kitchen table became a devastating truth. And listen, I need to say this to those of you still watching. How many of you have heard words like that from someone you care about? Maybe a sister, a friend, A coworker who confided they were afraid of their partner? Drop a comment with where you're watching from and let me know if you're still with me. Because what Elena foresaw wasn't paranoia, it was a warning no one could afford to ignore. November 18, 1986, began like many other working days for Elena Markovich Almazy, though neither she nor anyone else around her could have predicted it would be her final one. Assigned to Pan-World Airways Flight 447 from Frankfurt to New York, she moved through her shift with her usual quiet professionalism, tending to passengers with a grace that masked the turmoil in her private life. The descent into New York brought views of a northeast buried under an early winter storm. Through the oval windows, flecks of white blew across the landscape in thick waves, promising delays and disruptions for travelers eager to get home. At JFK, when colleagues suggested she spend the night at the crew hotel while the snow cleared, Elena refused. She had been away for days, and her children were back in Connecticut waiting for her. Weather inconvenience wouldn't stop her from returning to them. A Pan-World shuttle van carried her and 2 other flight attendants north through worsening conditions. What should have been a 90-minute ride stretched to more than 2 hours as snow thickened and roads became treacherous. Elena, usually lively during these rides, remained distant. While her colleagues recounted layover stories and joked about passengers, she stared silently through the frosted windows. When asked whether she was all right, she gave only a faint smile and said she was tired, eager to sleep in her own bed again. By 9 p.m., the van pulled on to Newfield Lane. Her colleagues watched her under the glow of her porch light as she dragged her rolling suitcase through the snow toward her home. They waited until she disappeared inside before directing the van back toward the icy highway. That image, Elena stepping into her house, hair dusted white with snowflakes, would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The following morning, while neighbors shoveled their driveways and children built snow forts, Karim Almazy was seen clearly outside his house, vigorously clearing his walk and driveway. He appeared oddly energetic, almost performative, given that his wife had supposedly just endured an exhausting transatlantic flight. When neighbor Mark Jennings greeted him and casually asked if Elena was resting after her long trip, Karim offered an explanation that would puzzle everyone who heard it. He claimed Elena had already left early that morning to visit her mother in Yugoslavia, slipping away before the storm became too severe. Jennings found this strange, since airports remained closed until well past midday. When he asked how she traveled, Karim muttered about buses to New York before quickly changing the subject. As the days passed, Karim circulated additional excuses. He told some neighbors she was in Copenhagen, others that she had gone to the Canary Islands, later shifting the story again to Switzerland. Each version seemed hastily constructed, stitched together to silence specific questions. The children, meanwhile, were abruptly placed in the care of Karim's sister, who lived several towns over. This alone unsettled Elena's closest friends, who knew she would never abandon her children without notice, particularly on the cusp of the holiday season. Calls from colleagues went unanswered, and friends grew increasingly frantic. Elena's confidant Claudia, remembering her chilling warning months earlier, became convinced something irreversible had happened. By December 1st, 2 weeks after Elena was last seen, private investigator Daniel Whitmore carried his findings and his grave suspicions to Newtown Police. He filed the report that officially changed her status from away on personal leave to missing under highly suspicious circumstances. From that point on, attention zeroed in on Karim Almazy, the man who, instead of protecting his wife, now stood as the chief suspect in her disappearance. When Detective Robert Hale received the missing person report for Elena Markovich Almazy on December 1, 1986, his instincts told him immediately that this case wouldn't be routine. Flight attendants didn't simply vanish without a trace, and mothers didn't disappear without calling their children, especially not one as devoted as Elena. Together with his partner Detective Carla Mendoza, Hale drove to the Almazy residence on Newfield Lane to speak with Karim directly. They found him in the driveway, polishing his car despite the bitter December chill. His demeanor was composed, but beneath it lingered an edge of irritation, as if their presence was an unnecessary intrusion on his carefully managed routine. When asked about his wife, Karim's answer was flat. "She's in Europe visiting family. I don't know why her friends are worried. She does this from time to time. The detectives pressed further, asking to see postcards, letters, or even phone records showing international calls. He waved his hand dismissively, claiming she called occasionally but always when he was away or unavailable. There was no physical proof of contact. With his consent, the detectives entered the house, expecting to find signs of everyday family life. Instead, they walked into contradictions impossible to ignore. In the master bedroom, long rectangular patches of carpet had been cut away, exposing the subfloor beneath. Karim explained them as damaged by a leaky radiator, but the radiator in question sat on the far opposite wall, untouched. Detective Mendoza quietly noted another obvious problem. The Almazis had no pets, though Karim also tried claiming stains had forced him to rip up the flooring. Moving into the bathroom, things grew more suspicious. Fresh caulking lined the tub and tiles, sloppy enough that remnants of stains were still visible beneath. A faint chemical smell clung to the room. Later testing would confirm the presence of blood despite attempt after attempt to scrub it away. Paint fumes clung to the bedroom walls as well, layers hastily applied to cover something else. The timing of these renovations aligned almost exactly with the days following Elena's disappearance. The material evidence deepened with financial records. Karim had purchased a large chest freezer in cash on November 20th, just 2 days after Elena's return from Frankfurt. Days later, he began buying fresh sheets, towels, and large quantities of cleaning chemicals from different stores miles apart, clearly an effort to scatter his purchases and avoid patterns. On November 25th, just a week after Elena was last seen, Karim bought something that would later horrify everyone who learned of it: an industrial chainsaw, together with heavy plastic sheeting and commercial-grade bleach. Asked about these items, he claimed the chainsaw was meant for cutting wood and the other supplies for closing the family's pool area. Neighbors contradicted his statements at every turn. Mrs. Connolly across the street reported unusual activity the night of November 18th. Close to midnight, she had seen Karim loading heavy objects into his truck, visible from her front window. Another neighbor, George Talbot, recalled seeing Karim with a rented woodchipper near Lake Zor in the early hours following the storm. This detail seemed trivial until detectives confirmed the rental date. November 18th, the same night Elena walked through her front door for the very last time. The pieces were forming a picture darker than anyone first imagined. On December 15th, after securing warrants, search teams pushed into the frozen terrain around Lake Zor, where the woodchipper had been spotted. What they uncovered there would transform suspicion into certainty and confirm their deepest fears about Elena Markovich's fate. The search at Lake Zor began in the early morning chill, with frost coating the ground and ice forming along the water's edge. Detective Hale assembled a team of forensic experts, evidence technicians, and volunteers to comb the area where neighbor George Talbot had seen Karim Almazi towing the rented woodchipper. The team focused on a stretch near the boat launch where tire tracks from Karim's truck were still visible in the frozen mud. Within hours, crime scene technician Lisa Grant uncovered the first grim clue: a small fragment of bone partially buried beneath a thin layer of snow. Using delicate tools, she carefully exposed more fragments scattered over a wide area. As the day wore on, the discoveries grew more disturbing. Strands of auburn hair clung to tree branches. Tiny pieces of tissue were found embedded in bark, and a dental crown lay half-buried in the frozen soil. Dr. Samuel Pierce, the state's chief forensic pathologist, arrived to oversee the collection of biological evidence. His preliminary examination confirmed the fragments were human and consistent with Elena Markovich's physical characteristics. The pattern of debris suggested violent dismemberment, with remains propelled outward in a fan-shaped spread consistent with a powerful machine's discharge. The woodchipper had been positioned to eject material toward the lake, where Karim likely hoped the water would conceal the evidence. But the snowstorm that had masked his crime also preserved it. The freezing temperatures slowed decomposition and kept fragments intact. Laboratory DNA testing, still a cutting-edge tool in 1986, positively matched tissue samples to Elena. Dental records confirmed the crown belonged to her, and microscopic hair analysis showed the strands had been forcibly removed. Forensic reconstruction painted a chilling picture. Elena had been murdered in her bedroom, her body frozen to facilitate dismemberment, then fed through the woodchipper during the storm's cover. The timeline and evidence indicated Karim had planned the crime meticulously, purchasing equipment and supplies in advance. 3 days later, divers recovered the chainsaw Karim had submerged in Lake Zor, weighted down with concrete blocks. Despite weeks underwater, forensic analysis found hair and tissue trapped in the chain mechanism matching Elena's DNA. This case reveals a harsh truth. Domestic violence can escalate beyond bruises and broken bones to calculated, horrific acts by those who appear respectable. If you know someone afraid of their partner, don't ignore their fears. Share this story and comment below to raise awareness, because recognizing these signs can save lives. The overwhelming evidence against Karim Almazy set the stage for a legal battle that would test Connecticut's justice system in unprecedented ways. Karim Almazy was arrested on January 10, 1987, at his home on Newfield Lane. When Detective Hale and his team arrived with handcuffs and a warrant, Karim showed no emotion whatsoever. No surprise, no anger, no protests of innocence. Just the cold, calculating demeanor of a man who had been expecting this moment and believed he was still smarter than everyone around him. His first words to investigators were chilling in their arrogance. "You'll never be able to prove anything because there's nothing to prove. My wife left me, and that's not a crime." Even when confronted with the forensic evidence from Lake Zor, Karim maintained his story with robotic consistency. The bone fragments were probably from animals. The hair could have come from anywhere. The dental crown was circumstantial at best. According to Karim, the entire investigation was a witch hunt fueled by gossip from jealous neighbors and hysterical friends. The case attracted national media attention unlike anything Connecticut had seen before. Reporters from major networks set up camp outside the courthouse in Danbury, and the story dominated headlines from coast to coast. The press dubbed it the woodchipper murder, a name that captured the public's horrified fascination with the calculated brutality of the crime. Legal experts debated whether a murder conviction was possible without recovering a complete body. Connecticut had never attempted to prosecute such a case, and Karim's defense attorneys argued that fragments of biological evidence weren't sufficient to prove beyond reasonable doubt that their client had committed murder. They suggested alternative explanations for every piece of evidence, claiming that Elena could have staged her own disappearance or met with an accident that had nothing to do with her husband. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Walter Flanagan, built their case methodically around forensic science and circumstantial evidence. They presented Karim's suspicious purchases, his contradictory explanations, his history of controlling behavior, and most importantly, the scientific analysis that conclusively identified the remains as Elena's. Dr. Samuel Pierce's testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. He explained to the jury how modern forensic techniques could identify victims even from minimal remains, walking them through DNA analysis, dental comparison, and microscopic examination of tissue samples. His presentation was so compelling that several jurors were visibly shaken by the implications. The first trial, which began in March 1988, ended in mistrial after the jury deadlocked 8-4 in favor of conviction. The 4 holdout jurors struggled with the concept of murder without a complete body, despite the overwhelming evidence. This outcome devastated Elena's friends and family, who feared that Karim might escape justice on a technicality. The retrial began in February 1989 with a new jury and refined prosecution strategy. This time, prosecutors focused heavily on Karim's behavior immediately after Elena's disappearance, emphasizing the cold calculation behind his lies and cover-up attempts. They brought in domestic violence experts to explain patterns of escalating control and violence in abusive relationships. The defense strategy remained the same: deny everything and demand absolute proof that was impossible to provide. But this jury proved more receptive to circumstantial evidence and scientific testimony. On March 15, 1989, after deliberating for just 6 hours, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. When the foreman read the verdict, Karim showed the same emotionless expression he had maintained throughout both trials, as if the outcome was merely an inconvenience rather than justice for his brutalized wife. Judge Robert Holzberg sentenced Karim Almazy to 50 years in prison, calling the crime an act of calculated evil that defied human comprehension. The conviction made legal history as Connecticut's first successful murder prosecution without a complete body, establishing precedents that would influence similar cases across the United States. Elena Markovich Almazy's murder forces us to face difficult truths about domestic violence that many prefer to ignore. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control. It was a deliberate act to eliminate a woman who sought freedom from her abuser. The warning signs had been present for years. Karim's need to control Elena's movements, finances, and relationships followed patterns well known to domestic violence experts. Isolation, financial manipulation, and the systematic destruction of her support network were not quirks or cultural differences. They were tools used to trap her and make escape seem impossible. Most haunting are Elena's own words to her friend Claudia. "If anything happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." These words reveal how deeply she understood her danger. She knew Karim would never accept losing control and that men like him see their wives as possessions, not people. Research shows the most dangerous time for victims is when they try to leave. 75% of domestic violence murders occur during separation or shortly after. Elena's case illustrates why these statistics are so chilling. Leaving an abusive marriage requires immense courage. Victims face financial uncertainty, custody battles, social stigma, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives. For women like Elena, who had built careers and social standing around their marriage, starting over meant risking everything. The system that should protect victims often creates barriers that make escape feel impossible. But there is hope in Elena's tragedy. Believing victims when they express fear can save lives. When someone tells you they are afraid of their partner, it is not exaggeration or drama. It is a cry for help based on lived experience. The true crime community embraces Elena's story not only for its brutality, but because it represents every woman trapped in a marriage that slowly becomes a prison. Her case exposes how domestic violence hides behind respectability and charm, how abusers often present as successful while terrorizing their families in private. This story demands action. If you know someone making excuses for controlling behavior, becoming isolated, or whispering fear, don't wait for them to ask for help. Reach out, listen, believe. Share this story and comment below to honor Elena's memory and help prevent the next tragedy. Karim Almazy served 32 years in prison before being released on parole in 2019. An old man whose name remains tied to one of the most calculated acts of domestic violence in American history. But this story is not about him. It is about Elena and the lessons her death teaches us all. Elena Markovich Almazy deserved to see her children grow, to travel freely in retirement, to live surrounded by love and respect. Instead, she became a warning about what happens when warning signs of domestic violence are ignored. Her legacy lives on in the forensic techniques her case helped pioneer, in the legal precedents that make prosecuting similar crimes easier, and most importantly, in the awareness her story raises about recognizing and responding to abuse before it turns deadly. The friends who believed her when she said, "Don't assume it was an accident," became her voice when she could no longer speak. Their refusal to accept Karim's lies brought him to justice and prevented him from escaping the perfect crime he thought he had committed. Thank you for watching this episode of Sinister Thoughts and honoring Elena's story with the respect it deserves. If this case moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of human behavior. Next week, we explore another chilling story where love turned lethal. A romance that began with flowers and ended in a shallow grave in the Nevada desert. Until then, stay safe and remember Elena's words.